I cannot be the only one in DC watching my discretionary spending right now, but you still want to go out and have a good time, right? So where in DC can you see world-class artists for free? The Library of Congress. They have presented live music in one of the city's most iconic spaces for more than 100 years. The library is seriously so gorgeous. I checked out their schedule, and there are some things on there that I am genuinely excited about checking out. On April 1st, we have opera singer Janae Bridges with the Catalyst Quartet. Let me tell you, I looked up a video of her singing, and sis has pipes. On May 15th, we have jazz great Christian McBride, who is a 9-time Grammy winner. And on June 4th, we have DC native, Howard alum, and rising jazz singer Ekep Nkwele. The Library of Congress has such a wide range of events, there is truly something for everyone. Tickets are available now at loc.gov/concerts. See a show that's sold out? Don't sweat it. The Library of Congress offers day of rush passes to all performances. So see what's coming up at loc.gov/concerts.
Today on CityCast DC, yesterday was an incredibly grim day for the Washington Post, and for our city, too. The Post, which is owned by Jeff Bezos, laid off up to a third of its staff. The sports section is being shuttered, the metro section is being cut by 3/4, and many of the critics who have followed local culture and championed local theaters have been sent packing. So my friend Jack Shafer has been covering the Post for 40 years, since he was the editor of Washington City paper in the 80s and 90s. He's the guy I call when I want to talk media anything. We talked yesterday as the cuts were going down, and we reflected a little bit about what it all means for DC. Today is Thursday, February 5th. I'm Michael Shafer. Here's what DC's talking about. Hey, Jack, welcome.
You betcha.
So you've covered the Washington Post for like 40 years, and for like the last 2 weeks of those 40 years, we've been waiting for the hammer to drop here, and it finally happened. Almost a third of the Post staff were laid off. How'd it come to this?
Well, the Post has gone through various contractions. I didn't have a chance to go to the archives and look it up, but in the aughts, when the paper was still owned by Don Graham and led by Len Downey, they pared the paper down. Anecdotally, I remember down to maybe 600 or 700 people, maybe closer to 6. So the reduction in the size of the editorial staff is not unprecedented. Obviously, when Bezos bought the paper in, was it 2014 or 2013? There was a influx of cash, new cash. Bezos talked about building a runway for the paper's future. So the cuts, which are dramatic, are not unprecedented. And so if you were looking for, a golden crease in the catastrophe here, the Post has cut back before and build up. But I wouldn't predict that.
And the pairing in the past was different in that what has happened today, and you can speak to this more than me, is that they have eliminated entirely certain functions, or massively cut certain functions that were once viewed as essential, like metro coverage, sports coverage.
Yeah, the growth of the metropolitan newspaper basically takes off in the 1890s, where prior to that you have a lot of specialized titles. Some newspapers in big cities cover banking or the business, or there's a more general interest paper. But starting in the 1890s, all successful metropolitan dailies started to build a bundle. And there wasn't just the news of what happened yesterday. There were international dispatches. And beyond that, there was massive sports coverage, primarily of college football and horse racing. And bit by bit, you turned the newspaper, which was, closer to like a tattle sheet or a newsletter, for most of the 21st century, grew the bundle grew to be bigger and bigger thing. It was like a home entertainment section. I can remember growing up in Michigan in the 60s, and we would get both. We lived in a town between Detroit and Chicago. We'd get both newspapers because each newspaper had, uh, comics or cooking for my mom's interests, or massive sports sections and puzzles for kids, and they the bundle kept on growing and growing. That include astrology columns and chess columns and columns assisting you in listening to radio. Um, and so that's that was the general vector of newspapers for the great lion's share of the 21st century. But the newspaper as an advertising and editorial vehicle seems to have peaked sometime in the 70s. People think of newspapers as being in the news business, when in fact what they were in for so long was in the advertising business. 80% of their revenues came from advertisers. And that's just not true anymore. You look at the Washington Post and it's almost devoid of advertising. So we went from a period in which advertisers were subsidizing news to today, where largely when it comes to a print product, the subscriber is bearing the brunt of the costs.
So, what's your understanding? What did they get? What got cut yesterday?
All I know is what I've been, reading today. They appear to have cut completely the sports section. I imagine there will be a page of scores and other related news. That was my reading of the releases. They appear to have completely removed the book section, which was part of the traditional bundle of a newspaper. And there are huge cuts of I understand that all but a couple of the people on the tech news staff have been let go. Major cuts in foreign coverage, and I have not heard the other shoe dropping on Metro, but I understood that there were going to be some Metro cuts.
That's my understanding. It's going to be down from like somewhere in the 40s to around a dozen people in Metro.
And this is astonishing. I mean, under the Grahams, the paper it had a national focus, but Don Graham, in particular, wanted it to be a local newspaper. And at one time, the Washington Post had bureaus in both state capitals of Virginia and Maryland, and it had satellite bureaus in most of the counties surrounding DC, providing, so compared to today, a sort of bumper crop of news. And, this has been whittled down over the years. So the cuts that they're doing today are kind of a reduction of cuts that they've been making for years and years and years now.
Another thing I saw is they have cut a large percentage of the critics they have. And this is, what's playing at the Studio Theater or at the 930 Club. What does that do to the city?
They appear to have given up on culture some time ago. They had I'm not a big touter of Pulitzer Prizes, but their dance critic won a Pulitzer Prize. Sarah Kaufman, I believe. Ann Midget was a classical critic. They got rid of her. They've been downsizing cultural coverage for the longest time. What I have noticed, and I don't know if it's just anecdotal, I've noticed that the style section is almost completely about television now. Years ago, the Post used to send out a couple of reviewers every night to write little capsule reviews of popular music. And you could stay on top of the culture that way. But they gave that part of the bundle too.
You have covered Washington in a, you were like me, you were the editor of City Paper, and competed sort of with the Post, but also covered the Post and sort of looked at the Post's impact. Can you talk to me about sort of what it meant then and what it is likely to mean in this different focus now?
Well, I think you'd agree with me that being the editor of City Paper, you were basically one of the charges of the editors, and I would say that this is true of you and of Eric Wemple and of David Carr and others that have served in that job. Um, we covered the Washington Post as a major institution.
Mm-hmm.
It was as important to the life of the city as the schools, the libraries, the police force, the Department of Public Works. It really was, a major institution. And at in many ways, a place like City Paper was a kind of weekly uh, press exercise in press criticism. We were hitting the points that the Post either couldn't or wouldn't um, go after. Um, and we were sort of like we were part of the editorial food chain, and it was the Washington Post by virtue of its size and its workforce. Was the major news predator that we all competed against, and for better or worse, to find ourselves against.
What do you figure it was of like all the news that was reported in Washington D.C. in this halcyon age? What percent started in the Post? And then other people found holes in the story that they could explore, or used video on TV or whatever. But
I would put it this way: that the Post set the news agenda for the city. It wasn't that Washingtonian and the television stations and City Paper couldn't find their own stories, but it was sort of the bedrock of
mm-hmm.
news, and not just today's Washington Post. The years and years and years of posts that you could, retrieve electronically. I had one great editor work for me, John Cohen, who, when our officers were down by the Martin Luther King Library downtown, used to go over to the Washingtoniana room of the library and go through the Washington Star archives for stories that had appeared 100 years ago,
mm-hmm.
or in that case, it's more like 80 years ago. Always finding, new ripples, things that had changed, things that hadn't changed. So the paper was, the Post was often, it could often be if the metaphor is tennis, it was the wall that you played against, that you hit your stories against to see if they would land.
So looking at your social media as this unfolded, it's pretty clear you think this is a pretty boneheaded thing to do.
I think as a news consumer, I think it's boneheaded. One of the questions I asked on Twitter today was, they've taken a paper and they've debundled it. They've taken away, like, the very first thing that I do every morning when I get my newspapers is I go directly to the Washington Post sports section. It's dipping my toe in the bath and seeing, taking the temperature of the day. There's no sport. There'll basically be no sports section. On Sunday, there'll be no book section. A couple of years ago, they got rid of the Sunday magazine. They've really pulled back on coverage of the Metro section. So what they're left with is, what they're saying is that they're going to cover like politics and national security and some foreign stories.
So Politico.
Kind of a Politico, yeah. And I don't know. I asked on Twitter, is that enough to justify a subscription? Is the Post going to uncover, how many stories is the Post going to cover or uncover that the New York Times already didn't get to? And I'm waiting for the Post to make a case to me of like, no, you really should keep your subscription. It's we're doing important and good work.
What's your answer right now?
Well, I hate to see any newspaper die. And, I, once again, the reduction in force of the reduction in headcount is dramatic, but if memory serves me right, they've got as many journalists working in the building now as they did in a low point in the aughts.
Although they never whacked a third at once.
No. But they still put out a decent paper, with a similar size force in the aughts. What's more disturbing to me than the count, the head count, is that of throwing away a third of the bundle, which is really important to me. So they never did that before. There was a great journalism review published in the 70s called More, not to be confused with the women's magazine More. And they published a story about the newspaper war between the Washington Post and the Washington Star in the mid 70s. And they, when both papers were rather credible and highly regarded. And one of the salient points they made was that the Washington Post was had the catbird seat because it had a bigger staff than the Star, and that was 375. So in the 1970s, the mid 1970s, the Washington Post put out a sports section. It put out a Sunday magazine. It had book coverage. It covered the counties and the state capitals and national and international news, and it did it with fewer people. So I'm, as much as I mourn the loss of these jobs, what I really mourn here is they're turning their back on what I consider essential parts of the daily newspaper bundle.
So I have been going to South by Southwest in Austin, Texas every year for a minute, and it's truly one of the highlights of my whole year. I go to a ton of conferences and events, and it feels like a whirlwind of lanyards and talks, and I leave actually feeling exhausted, like, hey, I showed up but have no takeaways. South by Southwest is different because I actually leave feeling nourished and energized for new ideas. Because South by Southwest is where the world's most creative, inspired, and eclectic minds gather to shape what's next. It's the ultimate gathering for the global creative community, where thought leaders, filmmakers, musicians, and other professionals across industries share the same space. And this year, I will actually be there talking about how we can make sense of this very particular moment we're all in media and culture. Innovation, film and TV, music and culture all collide when the 2026 South by Southwest conferences and festivals take over Austin, Texas, this March 12th through March 18th. For one eclectic week, the city becomes a playground for boundary-pushing ideas, world premieres, and live performances that turn into beneficial experiences. I once went to a secret pop-up concert of Solange Knowles at South by Southwest that genuinely changed my life. At South by, you can gain access to new ideas, people, and opportunities that do not happen anywhere else. So start planning your adventure in Austin and secure your badge now at sxsw.com/DC. Life can flip on a dime. 1 minute, everything's normal, and the next, someone else's mistake shakes your world upside down. And that's when you need a team you can count on. NACE Law Group has been standing up for DC families for decades, fighting for neighbors hurt by medical malpractice, wrongful deaths, and serious injuries. They don't just settle quickly or push papers. They dig in, fight hard, and make sure every client gets the justice they deserve. And here's something that I personally love about them. They are a longtime supporter of this very podcast. Because just like us, and just like you, they care about this community and the folks who call it home. So if you've been hurt or someone that you care about has, just pick up the phone. Call NACE Law Group. They'll stand with you, fight for your family, and make sure your rights are protected. And who knows, maybe you'll even see him at a CityCast live show. Visit WashingtonDCInjuryLawyers.com. That's WashingtonDCInjuryLawyers.com.
One thing that didn't happen this week is the leadership who I think got them into this position or didn't have a plan for getting out of this position. They didn't get the gate. What do you make of that? Will Lewis, the publisher, British gentleman?
Yeah, if we were talking about a political screw up, heads would have to roll, right? Somebody would be given the sack. Someone would have the decency to resign their position. Instead, it looks like, I don't know that we've heard yet from Will Lewis, who's been the architect of the Post publishing strategy for the last 3 years. We haven't heard from him at all, which is sort of surprising.
When Bezos bought the Post, I remember the sort of rush of like civic adulation for him. It was, here's a person, he doesn't need the Washington Post to make money, so he can fund it. And it turned out that the things he really cares about in his life are vulnerable to the government, and that puts him in a tough position as a newspaper man. What do you make of his stewardship?
Well, if we believe anecdotal reports, he's lost hundreds of millions of dollars. And, lots of people have said, well, it's no skin off his nose. He has billions. But what we find generally is, I call them the vanity press moguls. We've seen this time and again that people with a lot of money are attracted to the glittery thing that a publication can be. And they think, well, I can do better than the last guy. And it takes them a couple of years often to figure out that the problems that they thought were easily solved and that they could wrap them up are much more thorny.
Mm-hmm.
I would have to do a Vulcan mind probe to really figure out A, why it was so important for him to buy the paper, and B, why it was so important for him to spend all the money on the paper attempting to grow it, and what has caused his turnaround. We know that he's much more pliant. He stood up to Trump in the first administration, and I think it's fair to say that he's been pretty pliant in the second administration. I mean, the idea that the owner of the Washington Post is making a hagiographic film about the first lady, who's not really deserving of this adulation, doesn't seem to be the same guy. Was Jeff Bezos' body snatched at some point and replaced with some sort of automaton?
I say, and that stuff hit the Post bottom line, because a lot of people, when he killed the Kamala Harris endorsement, which nobody would really have been influenced by, the real material impact was like 200,000, 250,000 people cut their subscriptions, which is real money.
Right. They may have made a mistake there. They billed themselves as the resistance newspaper, and in the first Trump administration really ran up the subscription rolls nationally as being the paper that was standing in resistance to Trump. I don't know that was the best strategy, but it seemed to have been successful. Then came the dog years of Biden. So it was quite logical that when the paper no longer wanted to present itself as a resistance paper or anti-Trump, it's not much of a surprise that it lost hundreds of thousands of paying subscribers.
Right, which brings them into a pretty tough spot. Do you think he could? Do you think he wants to sell it? I mean, and do you think anyone would want to buy it?
Well, he obviously doesn't want to sell it because he's not selling it.
Mm-hmm.
Kara Swisher, former Post reporter, has gone on to great celebrity and written bestsellers and started a company of her own. Has talked about that she's prepared to, or has put together the footwork for a purchase of the Post, but they seem to be uninterested in selling it. So I can't really figure out the strategy. Um, this being a G-rated podcast, I think they either need to do their business or get off the pot.
Are we a G-rated podcast?
Don Graham would insist on a G-rated, and he would insist on the Meyer principles, which is his grandfather instituted at the Washington Post, that the the daily newspaper should be fit for ladies and children.
Well, in that case, listen, talk about what it means for DC. And, I sort of see there's sort of two things I'm interested in. One is like, what does this mean for sort of would-be scoundrels in public office in the city hall or wherever?
I think that boat sailed.
Mm-hmm.
How much do we know about um, city coverage? I mean, you grew up in DC, and city coverage was always part of the bundle. And this is not to denigrate the coverage of today. There's just not very much of it because it's a much smaller metro staff. So um, it's obvious that there'll be less watchdog um, action, and that's deplorable because you can't trust the government. It doesn't matter who's running it; you just cannot trust them.
The other thing is that things like, I mean, it's a little hokey maybe, but things like shared sports coverage or shared gossip in the reliable source, or just shared like storylines when there's some crazy scandal or murder or something that people talk about over the back fence. Um, Without a big dominant newspaper, it seems to me it's maybe a little bit harder for those things to break through and become a thing that can actually unify people in this crazy isolated world.
Yeah, I talked earlier about the Post being an institution, and the Post was something that everybody loved to complain about, and but everybody clipped and found essential. Um, I think a lot has always been made of how the Redskins, now the Commanders, were like this unifying force. Like everybody had some interest in the Redskins, and so it provided it provided the city and the region with a kind of identity. Um, the Post too, but the physical paper has disappeared, like you don't find it in street boxes anymore. You're not really expected to, because I think, what's the cover price on it? $4. But publications do give a city an identity. I mean, we know this from editing city paper, that it when you saw somebody carrying a city paper, you knew what kind of you thought you knew what kind of person they were. They were interested in the entertainment and the politics and the culture of the city, and
Or the sex
so,
ads.
what
Or the
or the
sex
sex
ads.
ads, which were very important, and eventually the Washington Post got around to. I can remember it was a red letter day in the '90s when they finally started accepting same-sex matches,
Mm.
because before then, you had to go to city paper to find that. Um, so no, publication creates a kind of identity for its residents, and that ship may have already sailed too, because um, we don't get a fully we don't in the old days, it was not uncommon that a family's only paid news outlet was its newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
And today, it's the iPad screen or the computer screen or the phone screen, and it's the source of all the news is sort of atomized, comes from a hundred different places. And I think with that goes the identity.
Just as a person who's spent a lot of time, you know, reading the Post closely, beating up on the Post, making fun of the Post, enjoying the Post, how, can you be emotional for a minute? How do you feel about? How do you feel today watching all this?
I sort of feel like, when your grandfather dies at 86, and you don't have it's a shock to your system. You knew he was going to die, it's a shock to your system. But but once he's dead there, and he's starting to stink in the parlor, you have a kind of physical reaction. This is a death foretold. In the mid 1970s, there was this great media reporter for the Los Angeles Times. He wrote a big multi-part series, and his lead was, "The thing that you're holding in your hand is an endangered species." Yes, the daily newspaper. So in 75, that everybody who was in the newspaper business, the editors, the publishers, Wall Street, all knew that the newspaper, as the dominant media outlet, was winding down. Why was it winding down? But basically, except for radio and then television, it had no real competition. But starting in the 70s, you have cable television, which siphons off a bunch of the advertising, and later the web. Mm-hmm. And it became, it's a very expensive thing to build presses. And I mean, a daily newspaper is in the print product, is a manufacturing and distribution business, the same as beer or paper towel, and everything, all the economic currents were running the other way to send the same information through a wire. So I think that was it was a death foretold. That's how I feel about it. That's how I'm regarding it. My grandfather, who's been threatening to die for some time now, is actually turning up. He's not taking the dirt nap.
Hey, Jack, thank you for being here.
Loved it. Talk to you soon.
Hey, it's Mike. Since we have been talking about whether anyone's going to be left to cover our city, I wanted to share a bit of CityCast news. In the wake of the Post's retreat, we're actually planning to add capacity, to hire a new team of journalists to cover the big beats that hometown DC actually cares about. We'll have more specifics soon, but in the meantime, I hope you'll support us back and become a member. You can sign up at membership.citycast.fm. Thank you. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.